Hello, this is the Lesson 1.2 tutorial. Here we're going to show you what's happening in Lesson 1.2 as we learn how to add colors and borders to our rectangles, add what we call gradients, and also change the transparency or opacity of those rectangles. So in order to do this, I'm going to be working in the sandbox with some starter code, and that's just a basic rectangle. So as we look at this, I think we can easily predict what we're about to see, and we already know that the color of this rectangle will be the default color, which is black. Well, we are not stuck with the color black. We can add some properties to this rectangle, and we just separate them with commas. So for example, there's a property called the fill color. So imagine taking a gallon of paint and just filling that rectangle with it, and that's the idea. We can use any standard color name. So for this one, I'll use cyan, which is a light blue. And let's see what this looks like. All right, no surprise. In addition to changing the color of the rectangle, we can also add another property that is a border. So the name of that property is border, and all we have to do is again specify the color. I'm going to make a brown border, and I hit run. So the thickness of that border was determined by the default value. Since we didn't specify a border width, it defaulted to, I think, the value 1. However, if we want to change that, we can include that property. Again, when it's not included, it just uses the default. But if you do include it, the border width property, you can specify a different number. So border width is all one word, and we call this camel case. And the idea here is just like a camel has a hump in the middle, likewise this single word, which is really a concatenation of two words, the capital W is there to give you the sense that there's two words, but we just took out the space. So this is still pretty readable, border width, and the idea here is that it's going to contain a value. So we can set it to something other than the default of 2. Let's make it much thicker. We'll say 6 for a second. So I'll click run. You get the idea. We can also set it to something thinner than it was before. And that's just, I guess we can go decimals if you'd like. So let's try 0.5 just for fun. There you go. All right, I'm going to set it back to 2 because the last thing we like to do now is change that border property yet one more time. And instead of keeping it as a dashed line, we're going to make it, a solid line, we're going to make it into a dashed line. So we just need one more property here, and that's called the dashes property. So in the simplest case, dashes is just simply on or off, or in computer speak, this property is set to true or false. Now the words true and false here are not in single quotes, not like colors. So this will change our solid border to a dash border, like so. Now, one more thing you can even control. If you would like to change the thickness or the spacing of these dashes, we can replace the word true with a set of parentheses. So this is kind of cool. Notice that when I open up a left paren here, it automatically opened up the right paren. That's a nice feature of this editor, so you'll never have a mismatching set of parentheses. Every left must have a right. So in this case, we're going to replace the word true with 2 values. The first value, I believe, is like the thickness or the width of the dash, and the second value is the space between them. So let's just try a dash line of 2, 2. Now, all that's going to do is make the difference between each dash a slightly smaller amount of space. And finally, remember that all of these properties here, the fill, the border width, and dashes, they are all optional. If you didn't have them, Python will still draw your rectangle, but without any additional information, it will just make it black and borderless. So let's continue with this process and add a couple more rectangles. So I've got these, I'm just going to paste them right in there. So there's 2 additional rectangles with different upper left corners. If we run it, we can see that they're just, there they are. Nothing special about them. So I'm going to give each of these a color since they're kind of boring the way they are. So I'll fill the color of the first black rectangle with the color, let's try blue, pretty standard color. And the second guy will do a fill of green. Students, don't forget the equal signs here, they're important. If you have extra spaces like I'm doing here, it's not going to affect anything. So perhaps the only thing relevant to say about these rectangles is that we can notice that they're lying, if you will, on top of that cyan colored rectangle that was defined above. So the idea here is that, visually our output will show that the most recently defined rectangle will run on top of anything that was prior to it in a sequence of code. Or in other words, another way to say this would be that the most recent program polygon is always on top. So if the program that you are creating, the image that you're trying to paint on the canvas with code, involves colors kind of being visible through each other, that we're talking about transparency. And so by default, all of the transparencies are set to 0 here. They're not transparent at all. But we have a property called opacity. And we can set the opacity equal to some percentage between 0 and 100. So if I set it to 50, that should mean that this first blue rectangle now will be you'll be able to see through it. So we should be able to see some of that lighter blue color underneath the blue one if we make it less or more transparent. So I'll run this so we can see what we got here. All right, so notice that in that opacity command, it made that color look lighter, but you could also now see what was underneath it. So if we change that, let's just go really low for a second. I'll put it to 20, even more light. And if we bump it up, say, to 70, all right, that's opacity. Has lots of interesting uses in different shapes that you're going to create. And for the last item, I'm just going to create one more rectangle. I'll just paste it right there. So this is going to be a default black rectangle, and I've just put it below the others. So in addition to the fill command, which only fills a solid color, there is a way to fill a shape with a range of colors that you specify. It's called a gradient. So we can set the fill equal to not a solid color now, but a gradient of colors, and now we just have to specify what our starting and ending colors are. So this will be really intuitive in just a moment. Think of a like a sunburst, right? In the middle is a bright yellow. Now that comma needs to be outside the quote. So we're specifying 2 colors here, a starting color and an ending color. So the start is yellow, that'll be on the inside. And think of this thing like a bomb exploding from the center and radiating outwards. And that's why we call this a radial gradient. There we go. It's kind of cool. Looks a little bit like the Japanese flag. Now the last thing we can do is we can control, obviously, whatever colors you put in here are going to have a different range. But what's happening here is the first color, yellow, was started in the very center of this. And then as you go out, think about concentric circles. So as the circles get bigger and bigger, the color at the edge of the circle is the same. So another way to think of this is like a ripple in a pond. All right, so as that ripple radiates out, the color is changing at the edges of the ripple, which is a circle. All right, that's a radial gradient. You can also control the starting point of this gradient. So let's just give it one more property. That was the fill color. And this is still part of the gradient command now, so we're still inside that inner parentheses. So the last thing we can do is tell it where to start the gradient. By default, if you don't say anything, it's a radial gradient. In other words, the start of the ripple is the center. But you could also, for example, go from left to right. So I need to put this in quotes, the word left now, and we'll see this just look different. So it's yellow on the far left end and red on the far right end. And as we transition from left to right, it becomes more and more red. We can change this to all four sides. So we can say top, left, bottom, right, and just change the direction. So for example, if I make this a right, it's just going to go in reverse, right? So the yellow starts on the right side and goes to the left. And you can also go top to bottom and bottom to top. But in addition to that, you can also go diagonally. So you could, for example, say top right. And now the gradient starts up here and it works its way from yellow in the upper right to red in the lower left. So we have four sides and four corners, so that's 8 different starting points. And of course the 9th one is the default in the center. Well everyone, that's it. I've shown you all that you're going to discover in lesson 1.2. Have fun with this, and we'll see you in the next lesson.